Hi, I'd like to cover three apologetic arguments for why Christians can believe that what we have in the Bible is not only true history, but namely that the history Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give in their accounts about the life and teaching and especially the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb on Sunday, that these things really happened. And because they really happened, we can believe that Jesus is no ordinary man. He is true man and true God, and we can take his word for it about the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Greek word apologia is where we get our English word apology, and apology in the classical sense of the word is not to say you're sorry, but rather it's to give a reason, a defense, a justification for your belief, or perhaps something you said or did. So, what is the reason? What is the apologetic for why Christians believe what they do about the Bible, about Jesus and God? Let's go through this first argument from fulfilled prophecy. The Bible has over 2,000 prophecies, prophecy in the strict sense, not just speaking what God says, but rather God says this thing's going to happen, and he says it well before it actually does happen, and then it does happen. The prophecy is fulfilled. The Bible has 2,000 plus of these, where the biblical record says something will happen, and then it happens. Right? Now, if you just say that that's not divine in nature, they were lucky guesses, let's, being generous, say that the chance of a lucky guess is 1 in 10, right? That this thing would happen. Well, probability wise, in order for all 2,000 prophecies plus to be fulfilled, you'd be dealing with something like 1 in 10 to the 2,000th. And any good mathematician, especially people who know probability, will tell you that when your denominator is that large, it's not just a small chance, it's really an impossibility. It's ridiculous to think that that could have just happened by chance. If it did happen, it was by someone's design, right? So that leads to, who could possibly know that these things are going to happen ahead of time, such that the Bible writers were aware of it and recorded it, and then they indeed happened, fulfilled prophecies. You would have to be God in order to orchestrate or know the future in advance. So, this is one reason why Christians are justified in believing that the Bible is divine in nature. It is not just the words of men, it is the word of God. Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies about the Messiah. The second argument is much longer and it might be called the evidential argument for Jesus' resurrection. How do we know anything about history? Well, we take the accounts of people who were there and wrote about it. The reason we know George Washington was a real person and the first president of the United States is the same reason we know Jesus was a real person, that he preached this Sermon on the Mount, and that he was crucified, died, buried, and had an empty tomb 3 days later. How do we know those things? In the same ways. We are taking the accounts of people who were alive and wrote about it because they saw or heard. They were eyewitnesses. And generally, we take their word for it unless there's reason not to. Reason not to would be if there's multiple accounts and they don't say the same thing. Or if the account that we have, another account comes out and says, no, 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 that's not true. It happened this way. Well, that would cast doubt. Then we'd have to look into the multiple accounts and see how we could investigate to figure out which one's being honest, if any. But if you have people saying, this is what happened, I was there, I saw this, and then multiple accounts say that, then you go, okay, well, then that's what happened. We have no reason to believe otherwise. So let's go through the gospel account. First, in a previous video, I covered why we don't have to believe that the gospel accounts have been corrupted. We have every reason to believe, by examining the manuscript evidence, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have been faithfully preserved in the copies that we've found, such that our modern Bible is not different than what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote, but we have every reason to believe it matches. All right, the second point, after we have a non-corrupt account, is that we want the account to be written by eyewitnesses. And in the case of Matthew and John, they were eyewitnesses. In the case of Luke, it's clear that he was a careful investigator of these things. He must have interviewed people who were there, like Peter, like Mary, for example. If you read Luke chapter 2, Luke records things about Mary treasuring and pondering in her heart the things that happened when they brought Jesus at 8 days old to the temple, and there was old man Simeon, and there was Anna prophesying over the child, and Mary treasured these things in her heart. How would Luke know that unless he personally talked to Mary and heard her tell that story, tell that tale, and how it affected her personally? Mark also would have been someone who would have gathered his information from firsthand sources like Peter or the other disciples. But you can see these guys saying that they are eyewitnesses of what they've talked about. And that's what you would demand in a court of law. If you bring in a witness, you want it to be an eyewitness. The third piece of evidence is that these accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are written so early that there isn't enough time for myth to have crept into the gospel. All right, and this is where I should talk a little bit about another time gap we're concerned with. So in answer to the accusation of corruption, we go, okay, when did the event originally, when is the original writing, and when's the earliest copy we have? And we want that to be a small time gap in order to minimize concern for corruption. Well, there's another time gap we're concerned about because of potential for myth, and it would be, when did the original event happen? Sorry, I guess my hands are backwards. When did the original event happen compared to when did people actually start writing about it? Because if an event happened in, let's say, 33 AD, Jesus was crucified, but no one wrote about it for 500 years, and 533 AD is the first thing we have on that. Well, 500 years, the person writing about it, their great, 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 great grandpa wasn't even alive for this event that they're writing about. How do we know that myth, embellishment, tall tales haven't crept into the account? So we want that gap from the actual event to the original writing to also be small in order to minimize concern for myth. And that's exactly what we have for the Gospels. You know, the things they're writing about, Jesus' 3-year ministry from 30 to 33 AD, they wrote about it maybe a couple decades later in the early mid 50s AD. So they're still alive to write about things that happened in their lifetime. They really were eyewitnesses. Also, if you read the accounts, they don't read like myths. Compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John to Greek mythology, and you can tell it's not apples to apples. One reads like historical account, the other reads like fairy tales. They don't give you the who, what, when, where, why. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do give you who, what, when, where. All right. It's written amongst contemporaries. So if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were lying or got something wrong, there would be contemporaries, both friend and foe, to correct their account. Friends would want to correct their account for one motivation and foes for another. Let's say that on Easter Sunday, the tomb wasn't really empty and Jesus was still buried in there. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are lying or wrong. Let's just say that. Well, why would a friendly audience want to correct them? Other people who believed in Jesus would want to correct them because they're wrong and they're lying. And Jesus taught honesty. Jesus taught truthfulness. So, you know, if Matthew or John were lying, the other disciples would be, guys, cut it out, right? We were taught to be honest and true in everything we say. Why would foes want to correct them? Because both a Jewish or Roman audience would be hostile to this idea that Jesus could have resurrected. The Jews didn't like him because they thought he was a false Messiah, the Jewish leadership. And the Romans, you know, ultimately had him put to death basically as a troublemaker, right? Caesar is our king, and this guy claims to be king, right? And the Romans are very good at keeping people dead and buried in a tomb. So why would they want to correct the account if Jesus is still dead? Because they would want to make it very clear, no, people don't escape from tombs that we bury them in, right? So both friend or foe, there would have been contemporaries to correct Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if they were wrong or lying. And there are 0 first-century accounts that attempt to do that. No account says that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got it wrong, that Jesus wasn't crucified, didn't die, or wasn't buried, or that his tomb wasn't empty on the 3rd day. If those things were false, you would expect some accounts to correct them, and there are no accounts that do that. And because there's no accounts that do that, we think it's true. This is what you would expect for a true account, that no one corrects it. All right, evidence number 5. If they were lying, you would expect them to have motive, and they simply don't. J. Warner Wallace is a cold case investigator, former atheist, and now Christian. And with his years of cold case investigation, he would tell you that in all his interviewing of people who have committed crimes and lied about it, their motivations always fell into one of 3 categories. They did it for money, for sex, or for power. And if you apply these 3 potential motives to the gospel writers, you just see that those could not have been their motives. They did not get wealthy. They certainly weren't after girls. And they did not get positions of power or privilege by local government, right? Instead, what they got was trouble, thrown in jail, stoned to death, beaten, flogged, killed. The disciples got nothing but suffering and maybe even death, most of them, for their refusal to stop talking about Jesus and his resurrection. All right, number 6, specific details. If you're going to make a lie, tell a lie, and you don't want to get caught, you need to keep it simple, right? The more false detail you add, the more you have trouble keeping your story straight when someone investigating asks you to tell your story again and again, and the more false detail you add, the more other people who may have been there could reject what you said. No, 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 I was there and that didn't happen. So and so wasn't there. But if you're just telling the truth, you're happy to provide specific details. And this is the kind of thing we see in the Gospels. They provide specific details, who, what, when, where, of the things they're talking about. Archaeology is the Bible's best friend. In John 5, for example, we get this detail of the specific pool and where it was and a little bit of what the architecture was like when Jesus healed this man who was lame and allowed him to walk. And archaeology has dug up what appears to be the exact pool that John described in chapter 5 of his gospel. Those are details you're happy to give if you're telling the truth. Evidence number 7 is damaging material. If you are telling the truth, you might be willing, if you're honest, to share embarrassing or damaging material, but if you're lying, you won't. An example of this is, the first the first witnesses of Jesus' empty tomb were women. But you wouldn't have women be your eyewitnesses if you were just making it up. You would have some credible, authoritative adult male be your first eyewitness. Why? Because in a Roman court of law, only men were accepted as witnesses, not women or children. But the gospel writers say no, the witnesses of the empty tomb were originally the women. And they had to go tell the men who were cowardly hiding, thinking they'd be killed next. And then the men went and checked out the tomb. That sort of embarrassing story is the way you would tell it only if it were true and you were just being honest. All right, these last ones I'll get through real quickly. Regarding those specific effects at the end of Jesus' life, that he was crucified, that he died, that he was buried, and that his tomb was empty on the third day. We have 10 Jewish and Roman historians that confirm those sorts of facts, right? They don't tell all the miracles and stories of Jesus. Most of them are, hostile to Jesus. He has a reputation amongst the Roman historians as a alleged sorcerer. You don't get a reputation as a sorcerer unless you're doing some supernatural and remarkable things. But they do confirm his crucifixion, death, burial, and empty tomb, right? So the disciples, the gospel writers, aren't lying about those facts. I'm going to skip number 9, less important. Number 10, if something really is this huge event, it would be public knowledge. You wouldn't really have to tell people about it. You would just appeal to their knowledge of it. And that's exactly what you get the Apostle Peter doing in his Pentecost sermon. And then finally, number 11, if you are telling the truth and you think it's important that everybody know it, then you might be willing to suffer and die for this truth, which is what the disciples experienced. But if you're lying, you're not telling the truth, people are highly motivated to avoid torture or avoid death, and they would eventually crack and stop lying and tell the truth under such pressuring circumstances. But the Gospels died for their message, and they wouldn't have died for a lie, right? So these are good reasons to believe, all of them, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are giving us reliable history of what they saw Jesus do and say in the events concerning his life. All right, the final one is that the Bible really is the Word of God. You would expect it to be different than any other book, and it is. Just read it. The book contains more wisdom than any human could offer you. The book contains a more fantastic story than any storyteller could give you. And at the center of that story is Jesus. And this man, the more you study him, I promise you will come to see that he can't just be an ordinary man. He's too good. He's too wise. He's too innocent. He's too bold. Right? He's too kind and forgiving and loving. He's too willing to lay down his life for others. He's too humble. He claims to be God. Ordinary people don't do that unless there's something a little bit wrong with them. And the only thing that seems to fit is that he really is. The more you study him, C.S. Lewis has this famous quote, the guy's either a liar, a lunatic, or a legend, or he really is the Lord. And I promise you, the more you study the Bible, the more you'll see it can't be anything but the Word of God. And the more you study Jesus, the more you'll see he can't be anything but the Son of God. All right, that's the end. Thank you for watching.